Welcome to Emotions and Reason, the sixth lecture in the Atlas University course on the objectivist account of reason and knowledge. I'm William R. Thomas. So far in the course, we've discussed the importance of reason to human life. We've discussed the conceptual nature of reason and the fact that it operates volitionally. And we've surveyed the nature of objectivity and the fundamental axiomatic facts that underlie objectivity and make logical reasoning necessary to forming knowledge. Now in this lecture, I want to turn our attention to the relation of reason and our emotions. And speaking of emotions, let me tell you, I'm thrilled to have this opportunity. And the truth be told, I'm a little bit nervous too. My plan for the lecture is to begin with the traditional view of the conflict between reason and emotion, and then we'll proceed with the objectivist view, considering what emotions really are and how they work. I'm going to explain Ayn Rand's view that emotions are not tools of cognition, and then continue by discussing what emotions are tools of, that is, what they're good for. So let's begin. Is it possible to be rational, given that we're emotional beings? There's a storied tradition that holds that emotion is the antithesis of reason. This tradition is reflected in the portrayal of Mr. Spock and the other Vulcans in the Star Trek TV shows and movies. Spock is logical, devoted to considering all matters rationally. But his people have achieved rationality by suppressing and eliminating all of their emotions.
Interesting. I find nothing interesting in the fact that we're about to blow up.
No, but the method is fascinating.
The original show had episode after episode where the emotional and intuitive humans know better than Spock what's the right thing to do, and when to be daring, and what really matters. This portrayal of reason being at war with the emotions traces its roots deep into the Western tradition. The Greek philosopher Plato, who was the student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle, portrayed the human soul as a chariot pulled by two unruly horses in his dialogue Phaedrus. The two horses are, in essence, reason and emotion. The 18th century philosopher David Hume modernized this theme. Now, Hume argued that human beings acted fundamentally on emotional desires. He famously wrote that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. And in recent years, the prominent psychologist Jonathan Haidt has cited Hume's argument approvingly. Haidt, who's studied how people make moral decisions, has compared human reason to a rider on an elephant. The elephant is our emotional, intuitive system. And like Hume, Haidt sees our reasoning as mostly doing what our emotions and intuitions tell us to do. A rider on an elephant is never in a position to force the beast to do what it doesn't want to do, is the idea. We don't just reason about how to act in this view, we just actually rationalize what our emotions urge us to do. And there are good reasons why thinkers have seen a lot of conflict between reason and emotion. I mean, anyone who's ever become passionate in an argument knows what it's like to rationalize for the sake of one's feelings. And most people know what it's like to have to try to think through issues while emotionally upset, such as after the death of a loved one, or after a car accident, or after a fall, or some other shock. And haven't we all had the sense that sometimes, in order to reason, we have to suppress our feelings like Spock does? Nevertheless, the objectivist view is that emotions are working well when they're generally not in conflict with reason. Objectivism doesn't accept the contrast of Mr. Spock and the emotional elephant. In reality, elephant riders do guide their beasts, and in reality, a logical person like Spock couldn't get far without having something like emotions. To better understand the relation of reason and emotion, we'll need to consider what emotions actually are. We need to consider the nature of emotions. And the place to begin is by clarifying what we're talking about when we speak of emotions. Emotions are one kind of mental state we have, and they fit into a class of mental states that psychologists call affective states, which are states of feeling. Emotions are also conceptual states. You can get angry over an insult, but you couldn't understand what the other person was saying to you except by using concepts and language, so the anger comes through your conceptual understanding. So to clarify how emotions relate to the rest of our mental contents, I need to draw a distinction between conceptual and perceptual levels of awareness, as well as a distinction between cognitive and affective mental states. Now, cognitive mental states are those related to being aware of reality. They're states involved in thinking and knowing. Our cognition begins at the perceptual level, which we share with the higher animals. Our direct cognitive contact with reality is through our sensory perception, via senses such as sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Our experience of reality through perception is automatically integrated by hardwired processes. This allows us to perceive entities as wholes. For instance, when we look, we see a tree, or a car, or a person, rather than just patches of light. Another cognitive mental state at the perceptual level is memory. The perceptual level just makes us aware of what is right here and right now. Or we have a memory of what was right there and right then. The conceptual level, by contrast, gets our thinking beyond the here and now. I'm speaking words to you right now. Perceptually, you hear the sounds, and you can see how my face moves. But you can be aware of the meaning of my words only at the conceptual level. Even a child can see and hear me, but only a person who's learned an ample vocabulary and who can choose to think about their basic mental contents is really the only person who can understand what I'm talking about. It's the conceptual level that lets you hear my words, yet think about your own mental contents and all the history of the mind across all of history and all the theory and throughout the world. That's the power of concepts. Conceptual level cognitive content includes the meaningful propositions that concepts make possible. And it includes theories built up of true propositions that allow us to think about the universe from its earliest beginnings to the farthest reaches of space. Now there, we've made a quick tour of the cognitive mental states, those involved in knowing, in being aware of facts. But there's a lot more to our mental life than cognition. A whole other class of mental contents exists, and these are the ones that are affective in character. Affective states are states of feeling rather than knowing or thinking. Affective states are psychologically motivating. They include an impulse towards action. At the perceptual level, we have hardwired feelings and dispositions that other animals have too. Affective states that include feelings of pleasure and pain. Now, pleasure and pain are a product of the nervous system, and they mostly don't vary with mental changes. Now, I say mostly because with a lot of practice, some people can affect some of their pleasure-pain responses, and people such as Hindu mystics, for instance. But in normal living, there's really nothing much we can do within our minds that will affect these hardwired responses. I mean, you can't just decide not to feel pain, usually. Now, other perceptual level affective states include our fundamental desires, such as for food or water, or the fight, flight, and sex desires. These desires are present in all the conscious animals, as far as we know. I would also count at the perceptual level the long-lasting affective states that help characterize us, including moods, such as being in a gloomy or a cheery mood, or personality traits, such as being quick-tempered or placid. Mood and personality traits appear to have their basis in hardwired aspects of our brain chemistry and our genetic development, and they don't respond easily to short-term stimuli. Now, emotions, which are my focus here, are conceptual affective states. Emotions are relatively short-lived mental states, and they appear in response to thoughts and situations. Emotions include joy and love, and fear and anger, and anxiety. Usually, these feelings arise in response to something. Something gives you joy. You love someone or something, or you're afraid of someone or something, or you're angry or anxious about something. And emotions don't just involve a mental feeling, they also involve physical movements, contractions of some muscles, and the relaxation of others, like a smile or a grimace or a clenching of fists. Emotions are a physical experience, not just a mental one. In fact, the physical feeling contributes to our sense of what it's like to have the emotion. Your heart races when you're falling in love. What would love be if you didn't feel it in your chest, in your gut? That's the key to understanding how emotions work. The key is to realize that as conceptual states, they arise from cognition. The emotions arise from thinking, in other words. They arise from reason. We can see this in the way emotions arise in our minds. They come about through a four-stage process. Now, the first stage is your awareness of a thing or event. You might become aware of something through your senses, or perhaps you might become aware conceptually, as for instance when you think about something someone has said to you. Next, stage 2 is identification and interpretation. In this second stage, you identify the thing or event conceptually, classifying it. You describe it mentally, and you relate it to other things you know. The crucial stage 3 is an evaluation. Is the thing or event good or bad? Is it beneficial or threatening? This evaluation depends on the standards of value that one has accepted. After all, what counts as good or bad in the first place? Only after these stages have been completed do we feel the emotion, the actual conscious feeling of fear, love, anger, or whatever. You don't feel an emotion without being aware of a trigger. That's stage 1. What emotion you feel depends on what you think the trigger is. That's stage 2. The actual emotion you feel varies depending on your evaluation of the circumstances. That's stage 3, and the emotion is stage 4. Now let's go over an example to see how this four-stage model of emotion works in practice. Now I've been teaching economics at a university, and recently I surprised my students with a pop quiz. We've all been there. Just the words pop quiz often evoke a spurt of remembered fear and anxiety. Oh no! Am I ready? The four-stage model shows how this works. Number 1, awareness. In this case, you perceive the teacher speaking. That is, you hear the sounds pop quiz and other words, and your conceptual cognition makes you aware of the teacher's meaning. Second stage is in identification and interpretation. You realize there will be a surprise test. I don't know what it'll be about. It could be hard or about something I haven't studied yet. Stage 3 is the evaluation. It could hurt my grade. It could reveal how ignorant I am. And the fourth stage is the emotion, in this case, fear. I've mentioned earlier that the stage 1 awareness could begin at the perceptual level or at the conceptual level. If we change the example just a little, we can see that you could have the emotion even without a perceptual stimulus. You could be thinking about tomorrow's class, for example, and you might wonder if there might be a pop quiz, and you'd doubt that you'd be ready, and you'd worry that then that would really look bad for you, and you'd feel fear. So in that case, the awareness that kicked the process off would be conceptual and abstract in your head and your imagination. Now, the pop quiz example shows that your conceptual thinking, your use of language, the knowledge you have, and what you believe to be true about what will help or harm you all affect the emotion you feel. But normally, when we talk about conceptual thinking, we're talking about thoughts we control, thoughts we direct in our minds, and mental activities we can trace step by step. However, while I'm sure for many of you the example of the pop quiz sounded like the kind of thoughts you could have had in that situation, I doubt anyone would have said that they actually thought through the 3 initial stages and reasoned through an evaluation before they felt the fear of a quiz. And if I'd said, no, I'm just joking, no quiz today, my students might have tended to feel an emotion of relief based on understanding me conceptually, yet still none of them would have reasoned through the stages of interpretation and evaluation before feeling the changed emotion. And this is because most of the cognition that lies behind the emotion is subconscious. The subconscious is the mental processing that's out of reach of the conscious reasoning that we're aware of introspectively. We can control conscious thought with our will, but we can't control the subconscious, at least not easily or directly. Its functioning is automatic. But the content of our subconscious depends on things we've learned and things we've experienced over time. Most of our mental processing is subconscious, actually. When you draw on a memory, you're drawing on your subconscious. When you have a hunch, that's from your subconscious. When you read a word or you move your body to walk or run or write or throw or talk, you're using your subconscious and your muscle memory there. Say you're at a restaurant trying to listen to your companion, but there's an obnoxious chatterbox across the room who you not only can't help hearing, you can't help understanding also. It's your subconscious grasp of language and meaning that makes the chatterbox's inanities bore into your mind like a diamond drill. Oh, it was delish, and Debbie loved it too, and it was to die for. And you would really rather not understand, but you can't help it. It's subconscious. And emotions are produced out of subconscious processing. That's why they seem to impinge on our conscious awareness, rather than seeming to be created by our choice. Here's how Ayn Rand describes emotions in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. She writes, "Emotions are the automatic results of man's value judgments, integrated by his subconscious. Emotions are estimates of that which furthers man's values or threatens them, that which is for him or against him, lightning calculators giving him the sum of his profit or loss." Rand's key points here are first, that emotions arise automatically from the subconscious, and second, that emotions serve as calculators of value. We'll be considering each of these points as we continue. Here's another example of the four-stage objectivist model of emotion that highlights the role of subconscious cognition in giving rise to the emotion. A classic experience of childhood is the fear of dogs, or of having a bad experience by failing to detect that a dog is dangerous. You know, you pet the cute doggy and it bites you. The subconscious evaluation behind emotions is usually based in past experiences and conclusions. And I think the way we react to a barking dog shows this. So at the first stage, there's awareness. There's the sight and sound of a barking dog. Now, where one goes from here depends on the memories and facts one brings to bear. On the one hand, a fearful child might respond to the dog this way. At the second stage of identification and interpretation, the child might think, "It's a dog. Dogs can bite. Barking means he's going to attack. I've seen a dog attack someone or threaten someone." And the third stage would be an evaluation that this was dangerous, and the fourth stage would be an emotion, which would be fear. Now, on the other hand, a child might approach the dog with a completely different set of experiences and interpretations. So again, at the first stage, there's the sight and sound of the same barking dog. So the sensory perception is just the same. And at the second stage, there's the identification and interpretation, but now the facts that the child is thinking of might sound like this if we conceptualize them, that it's a dog, dogs like to play, barking means he's excited and ready to play. I've seen lots of barking, playful dogs. So the third stage, the evaluation, is that this is an opportunity to play. And so at the fourth stage, the emotion is joy. And all this happens in an instant, but the subconscious interpretation and evaluation are so different in the two cases. In one case, the child shrinks away from the dog. In the other, it steps forward to pet the cute doggy. Now, since our subconscious conclusions reflect the pattern of past conscious experiences and thought, there's a kind of continuum between the conscious and subconscious that we can exploit to adjust our emotional reaction. For instance, we might talk ourselves out of a fear we don't think is really well grounded. But in many cases, and especially for children, it can be hard to talk someone out of their emotion by saying, to the first case, the frightened child, "Oh, it's just being friendly, it's excited." Or by saying to the second case, the uncautious child, "Hey, be careful, dogs can bite, he might attack you." An adult might have an easier time recognizing what was going on and getting some control over it. So, is a dog friendly or frisky? The point is, your fear or joy in the face of the dog comes upon you automatically. The emotion is the product of a chain of subconscious thought based in your past experience and your responses to similar situations. Now let's move on to one last example. Because our emotions derive from conceptual level identifications and evaluations, changing our minds about something or someone can sometimes bring about 180-degree reversals in our emotional response to the object or person in question. Sometimes this takes time, and sometimes it can happen pretty fast. I've had an experience like this with regard to ExxonMobil. Yes, the gasoline company. As a teenager attending a progressive school and living with left-leaning family members, I came to believe that the oil industry pollutes and makes disgusting windfall profits. Yick. The Exxon station in the corner of the street in my college town was something I looked on with contempt and loathing. Now fast forward a few years and I've studied economics and I've read Atlas Shrugged. Now, near my house, there's a Mobil station, and its clean, busy character and the immense value of the energy it provides are all things that give me real enjoyment to observe. And our emotions will change with respect to people too. For example, after he betrays you, you don't greet the sight of your ex-boyfriend with joy. Or when a new colleague shows how competent she is, your attitude toward her will probably become warmer. So, to summarize the nature of emotions, emotions are short-lived, affective mental states that are produced by conceptual subconscious processing in response to some event that we are aware of. They arise from the four-stage process that goes from initial awareness through an interpretation to an evaluation and the emotion. The process producing the emotion can involve a fair bit of conscious thinking, as in the example of thinking about the pop quiz, but it's the subconscious evaluation that brings about the emotion. With this understanding of the nature of emotions in hand, we're ready to understand what emotions are good for and what they aren't. Let's start with what they aren't good for. As Ayn Rand put it, emotions are not tools of cognition. Saying emotions are not tools of cognition is to say that emotions are not the means of forming knowledge. That's what tools of cognition are. They're means of acquiring knowledge. The basic distinction between cognitive and affective states already implies that emotions are not means of cognition, though, as we've seen, they rest on cognitive integrations and value judgments, so perhaps they might get a cognitive power indirectly. Let's look at this issue more closely. The truth of a proposition derives from its correspondence to reality. Now, let's say your favorite football team is playing in the Super Bowl. You may really hope your team will win, and it may break your heart and make you cry if your team happens to lose, but that's not going to affect whether or not your team really won. If you want to know who won the game, you don't ask how much you want one result to be true, you ask what the facts of the matter really are. Truth doesn't come from the emotions a proposition makes one feel. Truth doesn't come from having felt the right emotions when one thought of the proposition either. There are basically two related reasons why emotions are not tools of cognition, not even indirectly. The first reason I call non-objectivity. Inasmuch as the interpretations and evaluations that generate an emotion are subconscious, one has no conscious control over them. But objectivity is an intentional, conscious grasp of the facts. It's ensured by knowing that one is focused on the relevant facts, and only on the relevant facts. Subconscious integrations and evaluations may be correct, or they may not, but in themselves they provide no means of confirming their objectivity. The subconscious is what psychologists often call the unconscious, meaning conscious thought is not involved. It's a black box. And like any automated system, garbage in means garbage out. The second reason that emotions aren't tools of cognition is the principle that affect is an effect. Inasmuch as they're affective, Emotions are the product of a judgment, and they're not the judgment itself. Emotions are produced by judgments. The point of affect as an effect is that it doesn't matter whether or not the judgment is subconscious. The emotion is the result, not the cause. I just discussed the example of how I felt about Exxon, or I discussed the example of how changing your mind about your boyfriend would change the emotions that you felt in those situations. But even in those cases, the emotion was the result of the thinking. It wasn't the thinking itself. The point of both reasons is our emotions don't give an independent means of reaching an objective conclusion. There isn't any way to do that except by engaging in objective judgment consciously. And even though emotions feel authentic and powerful, and even though they're inherently motivational, still, they're the product of a process of awareness, identification, and interpretation and evaluation that's only as good as the reasoning on which they're based. That's why emotionalism, which is substituting emotions for reason, is a vice. It's one more reason to appreciate our need as knowers to be objective. So emotions are bad for reaching logical conclusions. But then what are they good for? Should we be like Mr. Spock, unemotional in order to be logical? Not exactly. Rather than being tools of cognition, emotions give us data for cognition. And they're part of a subconscious system that, we might say, supports and reinforces cognition. I want you to recall how Ayn Rand described emotions as lightning calculators, giving man the sum of his profit or loss. She says emotions are estimates of that which furthers man's values or threatens them. Now, about that. In his seminal book, Descartes' Error, Antonio Damasio argues, based on substantial evidence, that without our subconscious emotional system, we wouldn't be able to act reliably. The book's title refers to René Descartes' famous philosophical doctrine that the mind and the body were fundamentally separate substances. Descartes argues that the mind and the body are separate, but Damasio argues instead that the mind and the body are aspects of one unified organism. And that's a position that, in broad strokes, Ayn Rand held as well. Damasio argues that emotions and the subconscious recognitions that underlie them are necessary for us to be able to deal with our complex environment and to act reliably for the sake of values. He discusses brain-damaged patients who, while they're able to calculate and argue logically, no longer can feel emotions. These patients then fail to make good long-term decisions. They have trouble acting on principle, and they get distracted from their values and mess their lives up. They don't deal well with other people, and they have trouble distinguishing trivial decisions from important ones. Damasio recounts, in one example, one patient was asked to set up his next appointment. And when he was asked, this patient fell into a brown study. And he sat there thinking and thinking, because he was indifferent between two possible times, like whether he could come back at noon or at 2 o'clock next Tuesday. And he kept trying to figure out which one was the best choice, rather than just picking one. And that's ridiculous, right? Our emotions reflect judgments about values and about what's important that are embedded in our subconscious minds. And that's what makes them very useful as rough and ready guides to action. And more concretely, here are some specific ways we rely on and make use of our subconscious emotional system. For one thing, emotions give value consequences the immediacy of perception. They let us feel our values. When we love someone, we aren't simply able to list their virtues. We're able to feel that love as a motivating experience. But just to be clear, we need to be perfectly clear about this. Emotions are not really a kind of perception as such. I mean, sense perception is a direct awareness of reality. Emotions, by contrast, as we've seen, filter awareness through the lens of evaluation. And that evaluation, as we've discussed, isn't necessarily correct. Now, a lot of teenagers get in car wrecks because their emotions indicate that driving fast is fun, but their emotions don't indicate how dangerous it can be. Now still, when the emotions are based in solid experience, when they're in harmony with one's considered conscious values and objective needs, emotions do serve to make us feel directly connected to our values. And that's one of the problems that people with damaged subconscious systems have. They have trouble focusing on what's really important to them, and they waste time making trivial decisions, like when their next appointment should be, and they blow big decisions like whether to hold on to their jobs. And there's a broader problem that our subconscious emotional systems help solve for us too. The problem is how to orient ourselves in our physical and social environment. You could face in any direction at any time. You could say anything or take any number of actions. And how do you judge what's appropriate or what's needed? You can pay conscious attention only to a tiny part of what's really going on around you at any time. You have to focus your attention there. Antonio Damasio and various philosophers call this the frame problem. Our emotions and the subconscious inclinations and automatized reactions that lie behind them help us frame the world around us so we don't have to figure out everything all the time. For example, when a door slams nearby and you feel a spurt of concern, perhaps fear even, and your attention goes to the sound and its implications, that's your subconscious framing the situation and directing you first to what habit has deemed an important thing. And because they're connected to the subconscious, often feelings can be right when our reasoning is incomplete or wrong. But again, that can only be confirmed by reasoning in the end. If, for example, one often feels misgivings at a decision, and sometimes these don't stand up to scrutiny, but sometimes the misgivings derive from a fuller subconscious recognition. The emotions are drawing on the power of the subconscious. In Is Virtue Only a Means to Happiness, an Objectivist Studies monograph I edited, the philosopher Neera Bhadwar calls our attention to the many passages in Ayn Rand's novels where the hero's emotions are leading them in the right direction while their conscious conclusions are leading them wrong. Take the wealthy, rebellious socialite Dominique Franken in The Fountainhead. When she meets the brilliant architect Howard Rourke, he's working as a laborer in a quarry. Dominique is fascinated and infuriated by Rourke and strangely attracted to him, pretty much despite her conscious convictions. And the first time they have sex together, she's very confused about it and is in a very confused state of mind, convinced that she's been assaulted by a rough laborer and taking a perverse pleasure in it. And then for various reasons in the novel, they don't see each other for a few months. And when Dominique meets Rourke again, this time he's a notable architect at an elegant party, and she's absolutely stunned to realize that she's fallen in love with a man who isn't just physically attractive to her, but also represents her ideal of artistic brilliance. The point is, she felt the attraction before she knew or understood the full facts. Her emotions responded to who he really was from the first, not who she understood him to be. And in fact, if you read the novel, you'll see her emotions would have left her cold to any lesser man. Now, usually there are good reasons to think your emotions have a base in your experience of life and your values. For that reason, we should always regard our emotional reactions as important data about our overall state of mind. In any case, emotions that conflict with our conscious judgment usually imply that we need to do some rethinking. Another important use of emotions comes from the way they're tied into our subconscious systems for understanding and dealing with others. Emotional intelligence is your ability to read other people and attend to subtle cues about what they're thinking and feeling. And that's a subconscious skill. It's tied in with an emotional sympathy with others. Let's say you show up at a work meeting and one of your colleagues seems down. Your subconscious awareness of social cues will help you read the situation and pick up on something odd in your colleague's manner. Your ability to sympathize will let you connect with what it feels like to be in the other person's shoes. And that'll help you know how to act and what it might be constructive or helpful to do. So here's the bottom line about the uses of emotions. Emotions are a basic animal manner of experiencing value psychologically. It's healthy and good to be happy. It's healthy and useful to feel fear. Emotions are key data about our values and mental states, too. They're data that reason has to interpret. Emotions are a non-rational heuristic for knowing what to do. They help us solve the frame problem and help us recall what's important and worth paying attention to in any situation. They're part of the subconscious system that helps us stay locked in on what's mattered most to us in the past. And emotions help us respond appropriately and sympathetically to others. The goal we should be aiming for is a harmony of reason and emotion. We should be acting in the right way, for the right reasons, and with the right feelings. That's what a balanced, healthy, emotionally rich, happy, and meaningful life feels like. In Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's hero appears first as an emotional state. His face is the face without fear, or pain, or guilt. He's a person of utmost rationality, of total love for life and its values. It would be great to live in harmony with one's emotions like that. But if emotions are so useful to a rational life, why are there emotional conflicts? And most commonly, we have emotional conflicts because we've embraced contradictory values. We may have priorities in our heart, ones that we've built up since childhood, that are different from the priorities in our head. Or you may think you should approach others, for example, in an open, optimistic way. But because you feel threatened by them, you react with defensive anger to criticism. To fix the contradiction, you have to first determine what the correct evaluation is. If the error lies in your subconscious, you can try practicing affirming consciously the correct values when you face the provoking event. For example, if you react defensively to criticism, then when you're hearing criticism that you know is constructive, you might try to think about the benefits of improving your work or your habits. You think about what really matters to you. And all this might help you realize over time, subconsciously, that you aren't threatened. Or you may need psychological counseling to help identify the best way to resolve your conflict. Another common source of emotional confusion is an incorrect identification or interpretation. If consciously or subconsciously you're attributing false traits or misclassifying someone, this can lead to out-of-whack evaluations too. I think racism and tribalism are examples of this. When we falsely attribute stereotypical traits to an individual, we'll evaluate that person wrongly and then feel the wrong emotions in response to them. Not all affective imbalances arise from our ideas, however. It's common to have mood or personality trait issues that affect our emotional mechanism too. Our moods and many personality traits aren't necessarily created out of our experiences. Depression, for example, can arise chemically in the brain, and it affects the range of emotions one can feel too. And often, identifying emotional conflicts correctly and ameliorating them is a question for psychology and not philosophy. It's a psychological matter to tease apart the elements of our inner life that we can change through rational thought and behavior, and the elements that we can only change through treatment. In conclusion, I hope you can see that in advocating reason and logic, objectivism is not advocating an unemotional life or a lack of passion. It's not a question of making reason either the master or the slave of the passions. Really, the best life is lived rich in values and the emotional experience of values. We live best when we can use all our mental resources, including our subconscious and emotional resources, to navigate society and our world. A well-functioning emotional system helps reason stay on course and reinforces the principles we know to be objectively true. That's what it's all about, living as a full human being. The objectivist view of emotion makes it possible for us to understand how it's possible to live a genuinely happy life. And emotions, as we've seen, follow from our values. So if we hold values that support living a happy life, and we succeed in reaching our goals and achieving those values, achieving them in work, in study, in exercise, in love, and in friendship, When we succeed in achieving those values, then happiness is the natural result, because joy is the emotion we feel at success in tasks we truly value. And I'm happy to say, and I do mean that it gives me joy, that that's the consequence of the idea of the harmony of reason and emotion, the real possibility of living well as a rational being, living a happy life.